The examination table was cold, not the kind of cold that comes from a drafty room or a winter morning that hasn't warmed up yet. This was metal cold, the kind that reaches through two layers of clothing and settles somewhere deep in your chest like it has always been there and always will be. Lena Brandt had been lying on that table for less than 3 minutes, and already she could feel it in her spine, in the small bones of her wrists, in the tips of 3 fingers on her left hand that had never fully recovered from the winter of 1942. Her hands would not stop shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and told herself it was the cold. She told herself the same thing she had been telling herself for the past 3 days, ever since the American soldiers had walked through the doors of that converted barn outside Bastogne, and the world she understood had stopped making sense. She told herself, "You have been through worse. You have stood in rooms like this before. You know how to be still." But she had never been in a room like this before. The American medical facility smelled of something she had not encountered in 3 years of field hospitals and converted farmhouses and surgical tents erected in mud. It smelled clean, not the sharp chemical bite of disinfectant used to cover something underneath, but genuinely thoroughly clean, the way a room smells when it has been scrubbed daily by people who believe cleanliness mattered even when no one was watching. The walls were white. The floor had no visible stains. The instruments on the steel tray beside her had been arranged with a care that suggested the person who arranged them did this not because they were ordered to, but because they thought it was the right way to do things. None of this made sense. Outside the room, she could hear footsteps and voices speaking English conversations. She could not follow the sound of water running somewhere down the hall. A door opened and closed. Someone laughed briefly at something. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary working day, except that Lena Brandt was a prisoner of war in an enemy facility, and she was lying on a metal table waiting for something that she had been told in great and specific detail was coming for her. She closed her eyes. She said her own name inside her head slowly, the way her mother had taught her to recite prayers when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms. Lena Brandt, 26 years old, surgical nurse, German Army Medical Corps, Frankfurt. She held those words like stones in her palm. If they tried to take everything else, she would keep those. The door opened. A woman walked in. She was in her middle 40s with blonde hair going silver at the temples, pulled back in a practical style that said she had made that decision once years ago and had not revisited it since. She wore a white coat over an American Army uniform. She was carrying a clipboard in one hand and had not yet put on her examination gloves. When she turned from closing the door, her expression was professional without being cold, the kind of face that had learned to communicate competence and steadiness. At the same time, the face of someone who had been doing this work long enough that it had stopped being performance and become simply who she was. She looked at Lena the way a doctor looks at a patient, not the way a captor looks at a prisoner, not the way an enemy looks at an enemy, the way a doctor looks at a patient, with the particular quality of attention that is both personal and technical at once, that sees the person and the problem simultaneously and holds them together without confusion. Lena did not know what to do with that. "Guten Morgen," the woman said. Her German was basic, carefully pronounced, the German of someone who had learned enough to be respectful without claiming fluency she did not have. "Please sit up on this table. I will explain everything before I do it." Her name was Dr. Margaret Ellison. She had been born in Dayton, Ohio in 1900, the daughter of a family physician named Harold Ellison, who drove his own car to house calls in all weather and kept a ledger of patients who could not pay, and never once mentioned that ledger to anyone except his daughter, whom he took with him on rounds from the time she was 8 years old. Harold Ellison believed that medicine was a covenant, not a transaction. He believed that the moment a doctor began sorting patients by their value to society or their ability to pay or the side of any given conflict they happened to be standing on, that doctor had already broken the most fundamental promise the profession required. He said this to Margaret on many occasions, but the sentence she remembered most clearly, the one she carried with her through 4 years of medical school at Ohio State and 12 years of practice and 3 years of war, was a quiet one he had said in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday evening in 1918, when the newspapers were full of the armistice and everyone in Dayton was celebrating. He said, "A good doctor does not ask whether this patient deserves to be saved. A good doctor asks only, what do I need to do to save them?" Margaret Ellison had held that sentence for 26 years, by the morning of December 22nd, 1944. She had held it through medical cases that tested her patience, in cases that broke her heart, in cases that asked her to do things in conditions that would have been unacceptable in any civilian hospital. She had held it in France and in England and in a series of converted buildings that were never quite warm enough and never had enough of what she needed and always had more patients than she was prepared for. She had not yet met a patient who tested it the way Lena Brandt was about to. But we will come back to that. To understand what happened in that examination room and why it mattered not just to two women in December of 1944, but to a generation of doctors who trained in a rebuilt country 20 years later, you need to understand what Lena Brandt had been taught to expect. You need to go back 18 months to a mandatory training session in Berlin, to a hall full of German military medical personnel, sitting in rows with their notebooks open, listening to a man who was not a doctor explain what Americans did to their prisoners. The session was called Enemy Medical Procedures and Prisoner Protocol. It was led by an SS officer whose name Lena could not later remember, only his posture, which was the posture of a man who had practiced authority for so long it had become indistinguishable from his body. He had a pointer and a series of photographs, in a voice that was precise and confident in the way that voices become when the person speaking them has decided that doubt is a form of weakness. He told them that American medical facilities operated under the appearance of Geneva Convention standards. He said the word appearance with a particular emphasis, the kind that teaches the listener to hear quotation marks around words that previously required none. He said that what happened inside those facilities behind the appearance of medical care was systematic and deliberate and designed not to heal but to extract. He showed them photographs. Lena sat in the third row and looked at images that were grainy and staged in ways she would only recognize later when she had the distance to see them clearly. At the time, they looked like evidence. A surgical table with a body on it, instruments arranged in configurations that suggested procedures outside the normal range. A woman's face and close-up eyes, hollow expression, absent in the particular way that suggested something had been removed from behind them. This woman, the officer said, was returned to Germany after 6 months in American custody. The psychological damage inflicted during routine medical examinations has made it impossible for her to practice medicine. He paused and let that sentence find its way into every person in the room. Note that the damage was inflicted during routine examinations. This is how they operate. They do not announce themselves. They come in a white coat. They speak in the language of care. He told them that female medical personnel face specific risks. He told them to resist examination. He told them that if resistance failed, they should endure and survive and remember every detail for their report when they were exchanged through Red Cross channels. He told them that the Americans had no ethics, no standards, no genuine medical tradition. He told them that the oath American doctors claimed to have taken was a facade, a costume worn over something entirely different. Lena wrote all of this down. Everyone did, because this was mandatory training and because the photographs looked real enough and because there was no mechanism in that room for the question that should have been asked if this woman was so psychologically destroyed by her experience. Why is she sitting here in a controlled environment delivering a composed and detailed testimony? That question did not occur to Lena in June of 1943. She was 25 years old and had been living inside a system for 2 years that had been methodically removing the habit of that kind of question. Not through direct prohibition, but through the subtler and more durable method of making the question seem naive, making doubt seem like a form of disloyalty, making the person who raised her hand and asked the obvious thing feel that she had revealed something embarrassing about herself. Lena did not raise her hand. She looked at the photograph of the hollow-eyed woman one final time, and she made a decision. If she was captured, she would be that woman. She would endure whatever came. She would survive it and return and report it. She would not let them break her. It did not occur to her, sitting in that hall in Berlin in the summer of 1943, that the entire briefing was a fabrication, not exaggerated or biased or selectively presented. Fabricated. The photographs were staged. The witnesses were not witnesses. There had been no experiments, no torture, no systematic violation of medical ethics in American prisoner facilities. The whole architecture of the session had been constructed by people who understood that fear is most durable when it is specific and that the most dangerous thing you can do to a soldier is teach them to be afraid of the enemy's kindness, because then kindness itself becomes a weapon you can never put down your guard against. She carried that briefing with her for 18 months. It went with her to Belgium in the autumn of 1944, to a field hospital in a converted barn with a dirt floor and insufficient heating and never enough of anything. It sat in the back of her mind on the evening of December 19th when the shells began. She had been in the middle of a procedure. The patient was a young soldier named Carl, 19 years old, with frostbite damage so severe that the tissue in his left foot had gone past saving. She had been working for 2 hours under conditions that no surgical textbook would have sanctioned, with instruments that were not sterile enough, and light that came and went with the generator, and a supervisor who paced behind her and checked his watch, because they both understood that the situation outside the barn was deteriorating in ways they could hear but not see. When the first American shell landed close enough to shake dust from the rafters, Carl screamed and the lights went out, and in the darkness, someone was praying in French, and someone else was crying in German, and Lena's hands still gloved, still holding instruments, found the edges of what she was doing by feel alone, because she had spent 3 years making her hands into something more reliable than her eyes. The lights came back. The doors opened. American soldiers came through them fast and loud, and the first one who reached Lena was 20 years old with a rifle and wide eyes and the expression of a young man who had prepared himself for a number of situations and was now encountering one he had not prepared for, which was a woman standing in a pool of blood with a scalpel in her hand, looking directly at him. "Nurse," Lena said. It was the English word she was most certain of. Krankenschwester. She said both because she was not sure which one he would understand, and she needed him to understand immediately. He lowered his rifle. Not all the way, but enough. The older soldier behind him had already moved past her. He was looking at Carl at the table at the half-completed procedure, and what he did next was something Lena would not understand until much later. He called over his shoulder for a medic. Not for himself, not for any American soldier who might be injured in the building. He called for a medic to come and look at Carl, the German patient, the enemy. He called for a medic because there was a person on a table who needed one, and that fact appeared to override every other consideration in the room. Lena watched the American medic kneel beside Carl. She watched him check vital signs and begin talking in English. Oh, it was too fast for her to follow. She watched him reach for morphine. She did not have time to think about what that meant. There were 18 people in the barn who needed to be sorted and moved and accounted for, and the Americans were doing it with a speed and organization that felt to Lena less like the actions of an occupying force and more like the actions of people who had done this many times before and had a clear procedure for it. Medical personnel to the left, wounded to the right, separated, documented, moved. She never saw Carl again after that night. The loop of his story would not close for her until long after the war, and when it did, it would teach her something she had not expected to learn about the oath she had taken and what it actually required of the person who took it. But that comes later. The 3 days between Bastogne and the American processing facility were cold and cramped and confusing in a specific way that Alina had no category for. She rode in the back of a military truck with 17 other captured German medical personnel, all of them silent, in the particular silence of people who had been trained to say nothing and were now doing exactly that. The landscape outside was winter gray roads choked with military traffic moving in directions that confirmed what everyone already understood, but had not yet said aloud, which was that the war was ending and ending badly. Twice a day at stops that seemed arbitrary, but weren't American soldiers distributed food. The first time it happened, Lena did not eat immediately. She held the tin cup of soup in both hands and let the warmth travel up through her palms and looked at it the way she might look at something that had been placed as a trap, because that was what the Berlin briefing had prepared her to see: generosity as camouflage kindness, as a technique, comfort as the first step in a process designed to disorient and extract. Ilse Vogel, 29 years old nurse sitting beside her, said quietly, "They are fattening us up." Lena did not answer. She drank the soup because she was hungry and because it was hot, and because 3 years of field medicine had taught her that when food appeared, you ate it because the next meal was never guaranteed. On the evening of the second day, the truck stopped because a destroyed bridge was being cleared ahead, and the delay would be at least 2 hours. The American guard assigned to their section of the vehicle was young, maybe 19, with the kind of face that still looked like it was deciding what it was going to become. He was leaning against the side of the truck, eating chocolate, the kind that came in the American field rations, and he was not paying particular attention to his prisoners, who were all exhausted and still and presented no kind of threat to anyone. Lena was watching him the way you watch something that confuses you, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of a person trying to solve a problem that does not fit any of the shapes she already has. He noticed her looking. He looked down at the chocolate in his hand. He looked at her, he broke it in half without saying anything, and reached through the gap in the side panel and held the half out to her. Lena did not move for a moment. She was doing the calculation that the Berlin briefing had trained her to do. What is this for? What does this cost? What comes after? She could not find an answer. The chocolate was just chocolate. The boy was just a boy. She took it. She ate it in the dark as the truck waited for the road to clear. And she did not sleep that night. Not because she was frightened, but because something had shifted in the architecture of her thinking, and she could feel it shifting, and she did not yet know what it was shifting toward. The processing facility was a converted school building in northern France. High windows, original glass, still intact in most of them, American flags at the entrance and in the main hall, and visible through the window of every room she passed. It looked like a place that took itself seriously, that had rules and followed them, that understood its own paperwork. Ruth Baumann met them in the intake area. She was 41 years old, and her German was not accented German, not translated German, not the careful, slow German of someone working from a phrase book. It was Frankfurt German, her German, the specific music of the city where Lena had grown up, and hearing it in this building from this woman in an American uniform produced in Lena a sensation she could not immediately name, something between relief and vertigo. Ruth told them her name and her role and what would happen to them in the coming days. She spoke with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had given this explanation many times before and had learned through repetition to strip it of everything that might seem like reassurance or threat and leave only information. You will be examined by a doctor. The examination is required by international law. The doctor is Dr. Elizabeth Crawford. You will be seen one at a time. Someone asked what kind of examination. Ruth said standard physical, height and weight and blood pressure, screening for infectious disease, treatment for any injuries or illness. Standard. The women around Lena exchanged looks. They had all sat in the same Berlin auditorium. They had all heard the same presentation. They knew what standard was a word used to cover. Lena was called third. She walked down a hallway that smelled of the same clean that she had first noticed it at the door, walked past a room with a window through which she could see with American medical personnel working at desks, walked past a bulletin board with notices she could not read, walked past a door that was closed and behind which someone was speaking English in a low and continuous voice, the voice of someone dictating notes. At the door of the examination room, she stopped. She said her name inside her head one more time. Lena Brandt, 26, Frankfurt. She held it. She pushed the door open. The room was small and white and exactly as clean as the rest of the building. There was an examination table with a paper covering that crinkled when she climbed onto it. There were cabinets filled with supplies arranged in visible order. There was an American flag in the corner and a single window, and the particular quality of silence that exists in a room designed for focused work. Dr. Margaret Ellison was standing at the sink with her back to the door, washing her hands. She turned when she heard Lena enter. And this is the part that Lena Brandt spent 50 years trying to describe accurately, because it was both very simple and very difficult to explain. What she saw was a doctor washing her hands and turning around. There was nothing extraordinary in the movement. There was no revelation in the gesture. A doctor washing her hands before an examination is the most ordinary thing in the world. But Lena had come into that room prepared for something else. She had spent 18 months carrying a detailed picture of what this moment would look like, and this did not look like that picture. This looked like a Tuesday morning in a working medical facility. This looked like a woman who had made her way through her 30s and into her 40s by showing up every day and doing the job in front of her without a great deal of ceremony or performance. This look Lena would write in her journal 40 years later, like someone who simply had not received the memo that she was supposed to be frightening. Guten Morgen, Dr. Ellison said. She reached for her examination gloves. She picked up her clipboard. And in the 12 minutes that followed, everything Lena Brandt had been taught to expect from an American doctor failed to arrive. What arrived instead was a blood pressure cuff applied with clinical precision and released without unnecessary delay. What arrived was a stethoscope placed against her chest and her back and a quiet instruction to breathe in and breathe out and breathe in again. What arrived was a light moved across her eyes and a reflex test conducted at her knee and a series of questions asked in halting German that were not questions about military capability or supply lines or the positions of units she had served with. They were questions about nutrition and sleep and the history of her hands, which Dr. Ellison held with the particular attention of someone who could read work history and the patterns of callus and scar. At no point was there pain. At no point was there anything that required endurance. What there was in the 9th minute was a question asked in a voice that made clear it was a question and not an extraction, which was whether Lena had any injuries she needed to report. And when Lena hesitated, calculating as she always calculated now, Dr. Ellison set down her clipboard and looked at her directly and said in English that Ruth had not translated, but that Lena somehow understood in its entirety. I am not interrogating you. I am trying to help. Lena said my back, 6 months, from standing during surgery. Dr. Ellison wrote this down and said she would arrange for pain medication, and then she finished the examination in the calm and methodical way she had begun it, and when it was over, she removed her gloves and disposed of them and went back to the sink. She said, you have malnutrition and exhaustion, but you are fundamentally healthy. Increased caloric intake, vitamin supplements, rest. You'll be assigned to a facility with medical resources. Then she said, you can go. Lena did not move. The paper under her crinkled once as she shifted her weight. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Outside the window, she could hear the sound of the facility doing what it always did, continuing forward in its ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that the world inside Lena Brandt's chest had just become very quiet. I don't understand, she said. Dr. Ellison turned from the sink. Why didn't you? Lena started and then stopped because there was no grammar for the sentence she was trying to construct, no way to arrange the words into a question that did not reveal the depth of what she had been expecting, what she had been prepared to survive. Dr. Ellison looked at her for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level and certain in the way that things are certain when they have been tested many times and remain true each time. I took an oath, she said. First, do no harm. That oath does not have exceptions for nationality. You are my patient. Whether you are German or American does not change what I am required to do in this room. My job is to make sure you are healthy, nothing more. She paused. Then she said something that carried underneath its simple surface the quiet weight of a conviction that had been lived in and worn smooth by years of practice in conditions that asked it to bend. War does not suspend medicine. It does not suspend the oath. I do not care what your government told you about us. In here, you are a person who needs care. That is the only category that matters. Lena Brandt walked back down the hallway in a state that she would spend the rest of her life struggling to name accurately. It was not relief. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was closer to the sensation you have when a room you thought you understood reveals a door you did not know was there, and you have to stop and reconsider every assumption you made about the room itself. She had come in prepared to endure. What she had received instead was 12 minutes of ordinary, competent, unhurried medical care from a woman who had learned her profession from a father in Dayton, Ohio, who believed that medicine was a covenant and not a transaction. The 18 months of Berlin's careful architecture of fear had not survived it. And in the dorm room that night, lying in the bunk below, Ilse Vogel, who whispered that this was all a technique, all a setup, all stage one of something designed to disorient Lena, stared at the ceiling and felt something that was more frightening than anything the Berlin briefing had described. She felt a question forming that she had not been equipped to ask, not about the Americans, about herself, about what she had been doing for 3 years with her own oath, her own hands, the patients who had lain in front of her in rooms that were never clean enough on tables, that were never sterile enough, and had looked up at her with the particular trust that people give to the person standing over them, with instruments, the trust that says, you are the one who decides what happens to me now. She had decided in those rooms based on things that had nothing to do with medicine. That question would take 12 more days to fully arrive. It would come from a conversation in a small office, asked in the form of a single sentence by a woman from Ohio who would never consider what she did that morning to be anything other than ordinary. But ordinary Lena was beginning to understand was not the same as simple. And what a person chooses to do on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a small room with the oath they have taken, it tells you everything you need to know about who they are when no one is watching, and nothing requires them to be anything at all. The morning after the examination, Lena woke before the others. She lay in the lower bunk and listened to the sounds of the facility coming to life around her. Footsteps in the hallway, the distant clatter of something being moved in a kitchen, a conversation in English that passed the door and faded. She had slept in pieces the way she always slept now, dropping into unconsciousness for an hour at a time and then surfacing again into the dark with her heart beating faster than the situation required, a habit her body had developed over 3 years of field hospitals, where sleeping too deeply was a liability. But this morning, the fast heartbeat was not from fear of incoming shells. It was from the question she had carried into sleep and found waiting for her when she woke. Above her, Ilse Vogel was still breathing in the slow rhythm of genuine sleep. Around the room, other women shifted and turned on their narrow bunks. Through the window at the far end of the dorm, the sky over northern France was the particular gray of a December morning that had not yet decided whether to snow. The American flag on the pole outside moved slightly in a wind she could not hear through the glass. She thought about Dr. Margaret Ellison's hands. She had been trying all night to find the weapon in them, and she had not found it. She had gone back through every moment of the examination, every gesture and word and silence, and she had held each one up against the Berlin briefing's detailed portrait of what American medical examination actually meant, and nothing had matched. Not the blood pressure cuff applied and released without unnecessary force, not the stethoscope against her back and the quiet instruction to breathe, not the hands that had held hers lightly and turned them over to examine the frostbite damage on her fingers and then set them back down in a motion that communicated nothing except the completion of a clinical task. The Berlin briefing had been very specific, specific enough to be convincing, specific enough to feel like the product of documentation rather than invention. And yet, Lena sat up carefully so as not to wake Ilse and put her feet on the cold floor, and sat there in the half-dark thinking about specificity, about how detail is the primary tool of a convincing lie, because the mind treats detail as evidence of observation, and observation as evidence of truth. She had written down the details from the Berlin briefing. She had believed them because they were detailed. She had carried them for 18 months because they were detailed. She had not once considered that the details might have been invented by someone who understood exactly how the mind responds to detail. This was not a comfortable thought to sit with at 5 in the morning in a building full of sleeping women. She was still sitting with it when Ruth Bauman came through the door at 7 o'clock with a cart. Ruth moved through the room the way a person moves when they have learned to perform a task with maximum efficiency and minimum disturbance, which is to say she moved without ceremony, setting things down without announcement, working from one end of the room to the other, in a pattern that covered the space without wasting motion. On the cart were items that Lena could identify individually, but whose combined presence she found more difficult to process: soap individually wrapped, toothbrushes, combs, and arranged without drama or particular emphasis at one end of the cart packages of sanitary products. The room came awake around the cart, not with noise but with a particular quality of attention that a group of women gives to something that addresses a need that has not been spoken aloud, but has been present as a constant in wearing background reality for longer than any of them would have chosen. One by one, women took what they needed. No one made a production of it. Neither did Ruth. Lena watched her work and thought about what this meant, not as a gesture or a statement, but as a logistical decision. Someone in this facility had decided that captured female medical personnel required these items and had arranged for them to be stocked and distributed. That decision had been made by someone sitting at a desk somewhere, working through a list, checking boxes, allocating supplies. It was an administrative act. It was bureaucratic. It was possibly the least dramatic thing that had happened to Lena in 3 years of war, and it unmade something in her that the dramatic things had not touched. She approached Ruth when the cart was nearly empty. "Where were you born?" she asked. In German, because Ruth is German, he had told her the answer was Germany, and she needed to hear it confirmed. "Hamburg," Ruth said without pausing in her work. "My family left in 1933. I was 15. You speak Frankfurt German. My grandmother was from Frankfurt. I spent summers there until 1932. She set the last items on the nearest bunk and turned to look at Lena with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, that was simply open, the expression of someone who has decided to be honest because honesty is more efficient than its alternative. You want to ask me if I hate you? Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked around the room at the women who were her age, some of them older, all of them in German military medical uniforms that were worn at the elbows and still carried, if you look closely, traces of things that uniforms near surgical theaters always carry. She looked at them with an expression that Lena could not categorize as pity or contempt or compassion, but that contained elements of all three combined into something that did not have a clean name. I hate what your government made of Germany, Ruth said. I hate what they did to the country my grandmother loved and what they did to the people who could not leave the way my family left. But you. She looked back at Lena. You are nurses who were assigned to a war you did not choose. It is difficult to hate that. What about your family? Lena asked. The ones who stayed. Ruth picked up the empty cart. No one stayed, she said. She said it the way you say something that has had all the pain pressed out of it by years of repetition, the way a bone that has been broken and healed says I was broken once, not I am breaking now. She said it, and then she moved the cart toward the door and did not look back, and Lena stood in the middle of the room and understood that she was looking at what it cost a person to carry the weight of an entire history inside a professional composure that never cracked, not even in front of the people whose country had made the weight necessary. She thought about that for a long time. 3 days after the examination, Lena put her name on the list of medical personnel willing to volunteer in the facility's sick ward. She did it partly because she could not tolerate inactivity, and partly because the question that had been forming in her since the night after the examination had begun to press against the inside of her chest in a way that required movement and required the familiar structure of clinical work to contain it, while she worked out what it was asking. The sick ward occupied 2 rooms on the ground floor of the facility, both of them warmer than the dormitories, both of them organized with the same deliberate cleanliness that characterized every space Lena had encountered in this building. American medics worked alongside a rotating assignment of volunteer prisoners, and the patients they treated were drawn from both sides of the wire without apparent system beyond medical priority. A German prisoner with pneumonia received treatment before an American soldier with a minor hand injury. This was not a policy announced with fanfare. It was simply how the room worked the way a room works when the people in it have decided that the logic governing it is medical logic and nothing else. Lena absorbed this slowly, the way you absorb something that contradicts a belief you have held long enough that it has become structural, that has become part of the architecture you use to understand everything else. You do not absorb it all at once. You absorb it in pieces, each piece requiring you to quietly revise a room in the building of your understanding, and you do not announce the renovation because you are not yet certain the new walls will hold. It was on the 4th day of this work that she met Dr. James Keller. He was 28 years old and thin in the way that people are thin when they have been eating field rations for a long time and were not heavily built to begin with. He wore glasses that were slightly too large for his face and that he pushed up with one finger at intervals without noticing he was doing it. His English when he spoke to the American medics was fast and idiomatic, and Boston accented the English of someone who had grown up in a city where people talked quickly and meant what they said. His German, when he used it, was different, slower and more careful. The German of someone who had learned it from a person who loved it and had passed that love along with the vocabulary. They were assigned together to a case that required surgery. The patient was a German prisoner, 34 years old, with a leg wound that had been inadequately treated in the field and had developed an infection serious enough to threaten the limb. Dr. Keller reviewed the file at the door before they went in, and Lena watched his face as he read and saw the expression of a surgeon calculating variables, the slight tightening around the eyes that means the problem is manageable but will not be easy. 3 weeks untreated, he said mostly to himself. He's lucky it's still there. They worked for 3 hours. It was not a difficult surgery in terms of technique. It was difficult in terms of the conditions it had been allowed to reach, which required a thoroughness of debridement that was painstaking and slow and demanded the kind of focused patience that distinguishes competent surgeons from excellent ones. Dr. Keller had it. Lena had always had it. They worked in the particular silence of two people who have discovered without discussion that they share a professional language and do not need to translate it into speech. Somewhere around the second hour, without looking up from what he was doing, Doctor, Keller said, "You trained in Frankfurt." "Yes, graduated 1941. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother graduated from Frankfurt Medical School in 1928. Lena passed him the next instrument without breaking the rhythm of the procedure. "She practiced in Munich," he said. "General medicine, some surgery. She was there until 1938. Then we left. England first, then Boston." He paused to examine the tissue beneath his instruments. "She died in 1942. She never went back." "I'm sorry," Lena said. The word felt insufficient. It always felt insufficient when applied to that particular history, to that particular category of loss, because what had been done was not the kind of thing that sorry was built to address. But it was what she had, and she meant it in the way you mean something when you understand that the person you're saying it to knows, you understand the inadequacy of the word, and is not asking for more than you have, Doctor. Keller finished the section he was working on and moved to the next. "She told me something before she died," he said. "She said that when the war ended, Germany would need doctors. Good ones. Doctors who remembered what medicine was supposed to be." He pushed his glasses up with one finger. "She made me promise that if I ever treated German prisoners, I would remember they were patients first." He looked up briefly, just for a moment. "So that's what I'm doing," he said, "keeping my promise." They closed the wound and dressed it and moved the patient to recovery, and when it was done and Lena was at the sink washing her hands, she felt something that she would later describe as the first time she understood what a promise actually required. Not the saying of it, not the intention behind it. The keeping of it in a specific room on a specific afternoon when the patient in question was a man from the country that had driven your mother out of her profession and out of her home, and ultimately in ways that did not require direct violence to accomplish out of her life. She thought about that promise for the rest of the day. She thought about it in her bunk that night, while Ilse Vogel whispered in the darkness above her that kindness was a technique, that the surgery was a performance, that everything they were experiencing was designed to make them compliant before the real process began. She listened to Ilse, and she thought about James Keller's hands moving through 3 hours of careful surgical work on a man he had every reason in the world to let a different doctor see, and she thought about what it meant that he had not. She thought about the promise, and she thought about her own. The conversation with Dr. Ellison came on the 12th day. It came without announcement, without the feeling of a confrontation approaching, which was part of what made it so effective. They had been developing over the previous week and a half a working relationship that was professional and quiet and organized around the practical tasks of running a medical facility with limited supplies and a patient load that did not respect administrative convenience. Lena had proven useful in ways that went beyond simple labor. She knew surgical procedure. She knew inventory management. She knew how to triage a room full of competing needs with the efficiency of someone who had done it under conditions that did not allow for deliberation. Dr. Ellison had noticed this and had begun including her in conversations about the facility's resources in a way that was collegial without pretending to equality, that acknowledged competence without erasing the fact of their respective positions. On the 12th day they were in Dr. Ellison's office reviewing medication inventory, a task that required two people to cross-reference lists against physical counts, a task that was tedious and necessary, and filled with the kind of companionable silence that develops between people who have discovered they can work together without constant verbal negotiation. Dr. Ellison set down her pen. "May I ask you something personal?" she said. Lena felt a shift in the room's atmosphere, the way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives. Not threatening exactly, but significant. "Yes," she said, "in your 3 years as a surgical nurse." Dr. Ellison said, "Did you ever treat prisoners?" The question sat in the air between them. Lena looked at her hands on the table. She had been looking at her hands more than usual in the past 12 days. They were the same hands they had always been, the hands her professors at Frankfurt Medical School had praised for their steadiness, the hands that had assisted in hundreds of procedures across 3 years in 2 countries. They were also the hands that had passed instruments in rooms where the decision about who received morphine had been made not on the basis of medical need, but on the basis of nationality, and had done so without comment, without question, without the internal resistance that should have been there, and had somehow, over time, been trained out of her. Yes, she said. How did you treat them? And here was the moment that Ilse Vogel's voice in her head called a trap, called a technique, called the inevitable extraction disguised as conversation. Here was the moment that the Berlin briefing had tried to prepare her for by teaching her that American questions were not questions, but instruments, that the language of care was a language of infiltration. She looked at Dr. Ellison's face and she tried to find the instrument in it. She could not find it. What she found instead was the face of a woman who was asking because she wanted to know, with the particular quality of attention that Lena had seen in this woman's work every day for nearly 2 weeks now, the quality of someone who asks questions, because questions are how you understand what is in front of you, not because questions are how you extract what you need and discard what remains. We treated German soldiers first, Lena said. Always. If there was morphine remaining after our own were treated, prisoners received what was left. She kept her voice flat and even because the only way she could say the next part was to say it without inflection, to hold it at a clinical distance the way you hold a specimen observing it without being inside it. If there was not enough, prisoners did not receive any. And sometimes when resources were truly limited, prisoners did not receive treatment at all. We told ourselves it was the practical reality of wartime medicine, that we were required to prioritize. Did anyone die because of those decisions? Yes. How many? I don't know, I didn't count. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture. It was the silence of a truth that has been spoken for the first time and is now occupying the room in which it was spoken, taking up space that something else had been filling before. Dr. Ellison did not change her expression. She did not lean back or forward. She did not reach for her pen or her clipboard. She placed both hands flat on the desk, and she looked at Lena with the same quality of attention she brought to every clinical task, the attention that neither judges nor excuses but simply and completely sees. I'm not judging you, she said. War places doctors in positions that medical school does not prepare them for. I understand the conditions you were working in. She paused. But I need you to understand something. She said it the way you say something that matters enough to be said carefully, slowly enough, that each word has time to arrive before the next one comes. The oath I took says first do no harm. It does not mean first do no harm to Americans. It does not mean first do no harm to people on my side or people I agree with or people whose government is not currently at war with mine. It means everyone. Every person who comes through the door of a room where I am the doctor is my patient, and my patient is entitled to everything that word means, regardless of what uniform they are wearing, or what language they speak, or what their government has done. She was quiet for a moment. Because the moment I begin making exceptions, the moment I decide that this patient's life is worth more than that patient's life, because of something that has nothing to do with medicine, I am no longer practicing medicine. I am practicing something else that wears medicine's clothing, and I cannot allow myself to do that. Not because someone is watching, because I took an oath and I intend to keep it, and the keeping of it is not conditional on the situation being convenient. Lena had known this was coming, or something like it. She had felt it building for 12 days, this reckoning, this arrival of a clarity she had been simultaneously moving toward and retreating from. She had felt it in the chocolate on the truck, and in the soap on the cart, and in the 3 hours of surgery she and James Keller had performed on a man neither of them had chosen to treat. And it had been building and building until it was here now in this office, in the form of a woman from Ohio who was telling her in the language of professional obligation. Something that Lena already knew in the language of her own training, had always known, had been taught in the same medical school that had taught James Keller's mother, had sworn to uphold in the same words that Margaret Ellison had sworn. We were told you were the barbarians, Lena said. Her voice was very quiet. We were told you had no ethics, no medical tradition worth the name, that you would torture prisoners and call it examination, and there would be nothing we could do to stop it. She stopped. She looked at the wall above Dr. Ellison's head. But it was us. We were the ones who let people die because they were not German enough. We were the ones who decided that the oath had conditions that were not written in the oath. We were the ones. Dr. Ellison did not answer. She did not need to. Lena put her face in her hands and she wept, and the weeping was not what she would have expected weeping to feel like if someone had described this moment to her from the outside. It was not dramatic. It was not the collapse of a person undone by shame. It was something quieter and more fundamental than shame, the sound of a belief system that has been held in place by the pressure of necessity, finally being allowed to come apart piece by piece, beginning with the piece that had required the most energy to maintain, which was the piece that said she had been doing the right thing, that the decisions she had made and not made in those field hospitals had been defensible, that she was a good nurse who had operated under impossible constraints and done the best she could. She had done the best she could within a framework that was wrong at its foundation. That was different. That was the thing she had not been able to look at directly, and it was the thing that 12 minutes of ordinary medical care from a woman she had been taught to fear had made it impossible to look away from. Dr. Ellison let her cry. When Lena finally raised her head, the room was the same room it had been, the flag in the corner, and the medication lists on the desk and the window with its view of the gray December sky. Dr. Ellison was still sitting across the desk with the expression she always had, steady and present, and neither more nor less than what the moment required. She reached into her desk and produced a clean handkerchief and set it on the desk within Lena's reach. "What do I do now?" Lena asked. It was the only question she had left. Everything else had been taken apart. What do I do now was the thing standing in the rubble of the rest. "You heal," Dr. Ellison said. "You learn. And when this war is over and you go back to Germany, you practice medicine the way you were supposed to learn it before your government corrupted the teaching of it. You practice it without conditions. You practice it as if the oath means exactly what it says. Will anyone listen? Some will, some won't. That is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be the kind of doctor your patients deserve, regardless of who is watching or whether the person you're treating would extend you the same care in the same situation." She looked at Lena with the level certainty that had characterized everything she said from the first morning. That is what the oath requires. Nothing more and nothing less. Lena sat in that office for a while after Dr. Ellison returned to her lists, and she thought about what it meant to hold a principle not as an ideal but as a practice, not as a statement of who you aspired to be, but as the actual operating logic of your daily work. She thought about what it had cost Margaret Ellison to carry that principle through 3 years of a war that was generating reasons at an industrial rate to make exceptions, to decide that the logic governing this room should be the same logic governing the conflict outside it. She thought about a father in Dayton, Ohio, who had driven his car to house calls in all weather and kept a ledger of patients who could not pay. She thought about a mother in Munich who had practiced medicine until 1938 and had made her son promise something before she died that he had kept in a surgical room in France in December 1944, with his glasses slightly too large for his face and his hands moving through 3 hours of careful work on a man he had every reason to let someone else see. She thought about what a promise actually requires. That night, lying in the bunk below Ilse Vogel's whispered certainties, Lena Brandt made a decision that she would not be able to articulate fully for several years, not until she was standing in front of a blackboard in a rebuilt city with a new generation of doctors watching her. The decision was not dramatic in the moment. It did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way the most durable decisions arrive, not as a resolution, but as a recognition, as the acknowledgement of something that has already been true for longer than you have been willing to admit it. She was going back to Germany when the war ended. And when she went back, she was going to practice medicine the way Margaret Ellison had practiced it, the way James Keller had practiced it, the way James Keller's mother had practiced it, until they took her practice away, without conditions, without exceptions, without the asterisks that her government had inserted into an oath that had been written without any. She did not know yet what that would cost her. She did not know what Frankfurt would look like when she returned, whether there would be anything left to return to, whether anyone would be willing to listen to a 26-year-old nurse who had spent 3 years abandoning the principles she was now proposing to teach. But the decision was made, and decisions made in the dark, in the bunk below, a friend who cannot see what you are becoming, are sometimes the ones that hold the longest. The war had 4 more months to run, and what was waiting for Lena Brandt on the other side of it was not the Germany she had left, but something she would spend the rest of her life helping to build from what remained of it, stone by stone, student by student, one oath at a time. The truck that carried Lena Brandt back into Germany crossed the border on a gray morning in November 1945, and the first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the silence of a countryside at rest, not the particular quiet of farmland in the hours before the workday begins. This was a different kind of silence, the silence of absence, the silence of things that used to make noise and no longer existed to make it. No traffic on roads that had been major arteries. No factory sounds from the direction of towns that appeared on her map, but not when she looked toward them on the horizon. The landscape had a stripped quality, as if everything that had stood above a certain height had been methodically removed, and what remained was the foundation layer of a place that had once been something and was now waiting to find out what it would become next. She had been released through a Red Cross processing point near the French border with a document certifying her status as a repatriated prisoner of war, a small bag containing the items she had accumulated during 11 months of captivity, and a set of instructions for reporting to the Allied Occupation Authority in Frankfurt. The instructions were printed in German and English on the same sheet of paper. This detail, which would have seemed unremarkable to anyone else, struck Lena as significant in a way she could not immediately explain, and she thought about it for most of the truck journey east. Two languages on the same document, not one overriding the other, both present, both legible, both pointing toward the same destination. She did not know yet what she would find in Frankfurt. She had received no reliable information about her family during the 11 months since her capture. The Red Cross had a system for this, a network of inquiries and responses that moved slowly and incompletely through the chaos of a continent trying to account for itself after 6 years of systematic destruction. She had submitted her parents' names and last known address in the spring of 1945 and had received 3 months later a form letter acknowledging receipt of her inquiry, which told her nothing except that the inquiry had been received. So she did not know. She rode east with that not knowing held carefully in both hands, the way you carry something fragile over uncertain ground, giving it attention without gripping it too tightly, because gripping it too tightly was the thing most likely to cause the damage you were trying to prevent. Frankfurt appeared on the afternoon of the second day. Or rather, Frankfurt appeared as a concept in the landscape, as the place where Frankfurt had been identifiable by its position relative to the river and the hills and the particular angle of the late autumn light that she had known since childhood, and that had not changed because light does not change when buildings fall. The buildings themselves were another matter. Lena had been prepared in the abstract for destruction. She had treated soldiers for 3 years and had understood intellectually what artillery and bombing campaigns did to the structures they were directed at. But intellectual understanding and standing on the edge of a city you grew up in and looking at what remains of it are not the same preparation. The school where she had learned to read was a wall. The hospital where her grandmother had died was a foundation and a memory. The street where she had walked to the university every morning for 4 years was recognizable only by its geometry, by the angle at which it met the cross street, and the slight rise in the ground at the corner where a baker's shop had stood that made the best brötchen in the neighborhood, and which was now a pile of sordid rubble, because someone had already begun the slow work of separating what could be used again from what could not. She found her parents on the third day. The search took 3 days because there was no directory, no functioning municipal record system, no way to locate a specific family in a city of displaced people, except by moving through it systematically, asking everyone she encountered following chains of information that each led a few blocks further before ending and requiring her to start a new chain. She slept in a Red Cross transit facility the first night and in a church the second night, and on the morning of the third day, a woman drawing water from a public pump on a street she had already walked twice told her about a group of families who had been sheltering in the basement of a ruined church on a street she had not yet tried. Her father was sitting near the entrance when she came down the stairs. Heinrich Brandt was 58 years old and looked 10 years older than that which was the standard arithmetic of the war applied to the faces of the people who had lived through it on the home front. He had always been a contained man, an engineer by temperament, as well as profession, a person who organized his responses to the world with the same methodical care he brought to structural calculations. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the containment failed in a way that Lena had never seen from him in 26 years of being his daughter, in a way that told her everything she needed to know about what the past 4 years had cost him. He did not say anything for a long time. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at something they had stopped allowing themselves to believe they would see again. Her mother, Hilda, was in the deeper part of the basement, sitting with 3 other women around a small stove that was doing its best against the cold of a Frankfurt November. She was 55 years old and had been a primary school teacher for 22 years before the schools were closed and then destroyed, and the children she had taught were dispersed to places she could not follow. She looked at Lena the way Heinrich had looked at her, with the full weight of the not knowing finally set down, the relief of it, physical and visible, something you could see in the relaxation of muscles that had been held tense for so long, their tension had become invisible. They ate together that evening, the 3 of them in the basement, with 16 other families. There was soup. The soup was thin, but it was hot, and it was shared without ceremony, distributed on a rotation that had apparently been established and agreed upon, and was now simply how the room worked, the way a room works when the people in it have been through enough together to stop negotiating every small transaction and have moved into the quieter efficiency of mutual dependence. After they ate, Lena told them about the past 11 months. She told them about the truck through Belgium and the processing facility in Dr. Margaret Ellison and the examination room and the 12 minutes that had not contained what she had been trained to expect. She told them about the sick ward in Dr. James Keller and his mother, who had graduated from Frankfurt Medical School in 1928 and had practiced in Munich until 1938 and had died in Boston in 1942, having never come home. She told them about Ruth Bauman in the cart with the soap and the sanitary products, and the 2 words spoken without drama that contained an entire history: no one stayed. She told them about the conversation in the office with Dr. Ellison, about the question that had been asked and the answer she had given, and what the answer had cost her to say aloud, and what it had felt like to hear the oath she had taken spoken back to her by a woman from Ohio who had decided, apparently once and finally and without reservation, that the oath meant exactly what it said. Her father listened to all of this with the expression he brought to structural problems, the expression of an engineer receiving data that will require significant revision of an existing calculation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking at the floor of the basement with the particular focus of a person whose internal work requires external stillness. They fed you, he said, finally. They gave you medical care. They let you work. Yes. Then what we were told about the Americans was a lie. All of it. He looked up at her. All of it, she said again. Her mother had been quiet through the whole account. Hildebrandt had the quality of stillness that comes not from detachment, but from deep listening, from the habit of a woman who had spent 22 years in rooms full of children, learning to hear what was actually being said beneath what was being said. She had not interrupted once. Now she looked at the middle distance between her daughter and the far wall of the basement, and she asked the question she had been building toward through the entire story. If they lied to us about that, she said, what else did they lie to us about? No one answered. The question did not require an answer. It was not the kind of question that wanted an answer in the same way that other questions want answers. It was the kind of question that wants to be heard, that wants to sit in a room and be acknowledged as the thing it is, which was the sound of an entire framework of understanding beginning its final collapse. Not with a crash, but with the quiet inevitability of a structure whose foundation has been removed and which is only now beginning to understand what that means for everything built on top of it. In the basement of a ruined church in Frankfurt, in November 1945, with the winter coming and the city in pieces around them, and the long work of rebuilding still a concept rather than a reality, Hildebrandt asked a question that her daughter would spend the next 40 years helping a generation of doctors find the courage to ask about themselves. Lena thought about it through the long winter of 1945 and into 1946. She worked in the makeshift medical facilities that the Occupation Authority was establishing in whatever structures remained usable, facilities that were understaffed and undersupplied, and operating under conditions that would have been recognizable to her from 3 years of field medicine, except that now the enemy and the ally were sitting in the same waiting room, and both of them needed the same things. She worked alongside American and British medical personnel who brought supplies she had not had access to in years, and who operated with the practical integration of people who had decided that the logistics of rebuilding were more important than the politics of resentment. She was good at this work. She had always been good at this work, and the 11 months in the processing facility had given her something additional beyond clinical skill, had given her a framework for the work that she had not fully possessed before, a clarity about what the work actually was and what it required that expressed itself not in speeches or declarations, but in the small daily decisions about whose case came next and what it received when it got there. She did not talk about her time as a prisoner of war, not yet. She was still living inside the experience rather than outside it, still close enough to it that recounting it would have been description rather than understanding, and she had learned enough from Dr. Ellison's manner of speaking to know the difference. In the spring of 1947, a notice appeared on the board of the temporary medical facility where she was working. The Allied Occupation Authority was establishing a program of medical retraining for German doctors and nurses who wished to re-enter practice under the ethical standards that the Occupation Authority considered prerequisite for licensure in the rebuilt German medical system. The program was being run out of a former school building on the edge of what had been the university district. It would begin in September. The lead instructor, the notice said, was an American physician attached to the Occupation Authority's medical division. Lena read the notice 3 times. Then she added her name to the list. The program convened on a Tuesday morning in September 1947 in a room that smelled of fresh plaster because the walls had been replastered over the summer by a crew of young men who were learning construction trades under an occupation vocational program and who had done a thorough, if imperfect, job that gave the room the feeling of a place that was genuinely trying to be what it was meant to be. There were 40 people in the room, doctors and nurses ranging in age from early 20s to late 50s, all of them carrying some version of what Lena was carrying, the specific weight of having practiced medicine inside a system that had made the practice of medicine into something it was not supposed to be. The instructor came through the door at 8 o'clock. Lena was sitting in the 3rd row. She had been sitting in the 3rd row for 15 minutes, having arrived early in the way that people arrive early when the occasion matters to them. And she had been looking at the blackboard at the front of the room and thinking about a series of things that were connected to each other in ways she was still working out. Thinking about Berlin in 1943, in Bastogne in 1944, in a processing facility in France, in a cart full of soap, in a basement in Frankfurt, and a question that still did not have a clean answer. The instructor came through the door and set her bag on the desk at the front of the room and looked up. They saw each other across the room. Doctor. Margaret Ellison looked almost exactly the way she had looked in December 1944, which was to say, she looked like a woman who had decided what she was going to look like and had not revisited the decision, whose appearance communicated nothing except competence and the absence of vanity about anything that was not directly relevant to the work. She was 47 years old and she had been in Europe for 3 years, and she looked like it, but she also looked like someone who had found the work of this particular phase of the war, the slow and unglamorous work of rebuilding what destruction had left, to be exactly the work that she was supposed to be doing. She looked at Lena. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The room around them had the particular quality of a space full of people pretending not to notice something. Then Dr. Ellison said, "You came back." "I made a promise," Lena said, "to myself and to you, that I would practice medicine the right way." Dr. Ellison smiled. It was the same smile Lena had seen once in the office on the 12th day of her captivity. The smile that was not professional, that was not the expression of a physician in a clinical context, that was simply the expression of a person who is glad about something in the uncomplicated way that people are glad about things that matter to them. "Then let's begin," she said. She turned to the blackboard. She wrote 4 words. Primum non nocere. She set the chalk down and turned to face the room. 40 people looked back at her. 40 people who had practiced medicine inside a system that had inserted conditions into those 4 words that the words did not contain and never had. "This is not a rule," Dr. Ellison said. Her voice had the quality it always had, level and certain, and carrying the full weight of someone who means exactly what she is saying. "This is not a guideline or a principle or a professional courtesy. This is a line. The line does not move. It does not have conditions attached to it. It does not say first do no harm except in wartime, or first do no harm to people on your side, or first do no harm when you have sufficient resources to make it convenient. It says first do no harm. If you cannot hold that line without exception and without negotiation, you should not be in this room." She paused. "But I believe you can hold it. I believe that is why you are here, and my job for the next several months is to show you what holding it actually looks like, not in theory, but in practice in the specific and ordinary conditions of daily medical work, where the oath is tested not in dramatic moments, but in the small decisions that no one is watching you make." Lena sat in the third row and listened to this and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Not because the words were new to her, she had heard these words in various forms over the past 3 years. But there was a difference between hearing something and hearing it in a room full of people who needed to hear it in a rebuilt city from a woman who had proven through her own practice that the words were not aspirational but operational, that they described not an ideal but a method. The program ran for 8 months. It was not easy. Not because the material was conceptually difficult, but because learning to see your own practice clearly, to examine the decisions you made and the reasoning you used, and the moments when the reasoning had been quietly replaced by something else, without your full awareness. That kind of learning requires a particular willingness to be uncomfortable. That is harder than most other kinds of hard work. Lena was better at it than many of her classmates, not because she was more intelligent or more honest, but because she had already done the first and most painful part of it in an office in France. In December 1944, had already said the true thing aloud to a person who received it without flinching, and so the ground of it was not entirely new to her. She finished the program in May 1948. She enrolled in the reconstruction of Frankfurt Medical School that autumn and completed her medical degree in 1952, specializing in trauma surgery, which was the specialty that the city around her most needed and which suited her particular combination of skills and temperament, the steady hands and the calm focus and the ability to make decisions quickly and hold them without second-guessing herself in the middle of a procedure. Her first professor wrote in her assessment file, "Hands that do not shake, eyes that do not leave the wound," rare in someone this young. She read that and thought about a field hospital in Belgium and a 19-year-old boy named Carl in a procedure interrupted by artillery. And she thought it was not that the quality was rare in young people, but that it was trained out of most of them by systems that rewarded a different set of responses, and that what her years of field medicine had done among its many costs was preserve in her the clinical steadiness that the same years had tried to compromise in other ways. She began teaching at Frankfurt Medical School in 1961. Her first lecture every academic year was the same lecture. She had given it so many times over the years that the words had worn smooth with repetition, the way a path wears smooth when enough people walk it, and yet the lecture never felt routine to her, because the students in the room were always new to it, were always encountering it for the first time, were always sitting in the particular posture of people who believe they already know what they are about to be told. She would look at them and ask who knew the Hippocratic Oath. Every hand would rise. She would ask who believed they would keep it. Every hand would stay up. She would say in 1941, "I also thought so." And then she would tell them the story, all of it, the parts that reflected well on her and the parts that did not, the Berlin briefing, in the field hospitals, in the decisions she had made and not made, and the patients who had died because of those decisions, and the number she could not give because she had not counted. She told them about the truck and the chocolate in the examination room, and 12 minutes of ordinary medical care that had contained more moral instruction than the entire 4 years of her formal education. She told them about James Keller and his mother and a promise kept in a surgical room in France. She told them about Ruth Bauman and 2 words spoken in a voice that had learned to carry them without breaking. She told them every year about the cart with the soap, because the cart with the soap was the thing she returned to most often, in her own thinking, the detail that seemed most resistant to abstraction, most insistent on remaining concrete and specific. A cart, soap, toothbrushes, sanitary products, distributed by a woman from Hamburg who had lost everyone she had left behind, distributed to women who had been soldiers in the army of the country that had made those losses necessary, distributed without drama or announcement, or any apparent expectation of acknowledgement. That was what it looked like to practice the oath without conditions, not the dramatic gesture, not the grand statement, the cart, the distribution, the continuation of ordinary human dignity in circumstances that had established extensive precedent for abandoning it. She taught this for 33 years. She taught it through the reconstruction of the 1950s and the prosperity of the 1960s and the upheavals of the 1970s and the gradual, uneven, imperfect process by which a country tried to understand what it had done and what that understanding required of it going forward. She taught it to students who became doctors, who trained students who became doctors, and the teaching spread through the German medical system in the way that good teaching spreads not as doctrine, but as practice, not as a set of rules, but as a way of seeing, as a habit of asking a particular question before making a particular kind of decision. The question was, does this decision follow from the oath I took or from something else? It was a simple question. It was also, as Lena had discovered in 3 years of field medicine and 11 months of captivity and 40 years of practice, the hardest question in medicine. In September 1988, she received a letter. The envelope was American, the postmark Boston, the handwriting, the careful, slow script of someone whose hands had begun to lose their precision, but who was determined not to let that show more than necessary. She opened it at her desk in her office at Frankfurt Medical School, where the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that had not changed in 27 years of occupying the same room, and she read it slowly. Dr. James Keller was retiring. 40 years of medicine. He had kept his promise to his mother, he wrote, had treated everyone the same, had operated on people who would not have done the same for him, and had done it not because it was easy, but because his mother was right, and because easy was not the relevant criterion. He had followed the work that Lena was doing in Germany from a distance, had heard from colleagues who had trained in Frankfurt about the way the teaching there addressed questions that most medical training in most countries treated as settled. He had wanted her to know that he thought she had kept her promise too. Then he told her something he had never told her in France in 1944. He told her about the patient they had operated on together, the German soldier with the infected leg wound. And he told her that he had read that soldier's file before they went into the room, and he told her what was in the file, and he told her that he had operated anyway, and he told her why. He wrote, the moment you start deciding which patients deserve to live according to your own criteria for deserving, you stop practicing medicine and start practicing something else. My mother taught me that. She taught it to me not with words, but by practicing it herself in Munich for 10 years in conditions that were already making it difficult, and then more difficult, and then impossible. She never stopped practicing it until they made it impossible. And she made me promise to carry it forward into the places she could not go. Lena read the letter 3 times. Then she took it to the wall where she kept the 2 things that had been on that wall since 1952, since the first day she had occupied this office. She framed it and hung it beside the other framed document, and she stood back and looked at both of them together for a while. The letter. And beside it, older and slightly yellowed, a single sheet of paper that had been folded and refolded many times during the months when she carried it in a pocket before she understood that it should be framed rather than carried. A medical record. 1 page, dated December 22nd, 1944. The header identified it as the documentation of a standard intake examination at an Allied prisoner processing facility. The patient's name was printed at the top. Her name, Lena Brandt, followed by her age and rank and professional classification. The diagnosis section contained 3 lines: malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, chronic lower back pain of occupational origin. The treatment plan contained 3 lines: vitamin supplementation, increased caloric intake, rest with pain management as needed. At the bottom, a signature. Dr. Margaret Ellison, MD. The signature of a woman from Dayton, Ohio, who had learned medicine from her father and had carried 1 sentence of his through 40 years of practice and had kept it intact through everything that practice had asked it to survive. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The documentation of 12 minutes of standard medical procedure in a small white room in the middle of a war. Lena looked at it the way she had looked at it many times over the years, always finding in it the same thing, which was the proof that the choice was always available. That even in December 1944, in a converted school building with insufficient heat and limited supplies and 18 enemy prisoners to process before lunch, the choice to honor the oath fully and without exception had been available and had been made. Not because the circumstances required it. The circumstances would have accommodated a different choice without comment. Not because anyone was watching, not because there was a reward attached to it or a punishment for its absence. because a woman had taken an oath and had decided that the taking of it was the permanent and unconditional thing, and that everything else, including the identity of the person lying on the table, was the variable. October 1994. Lena Brandt was 76 years old. She stood in front of a lecture hall containing 80 first-year medical students, ranging in age from 18 to 22, and she looked at them the way she had looked at every group of first-year students for 33 years, with the particular combination of hope and seriousness that the occasion had always produced in her, and that the repetition had not diminished. This was her last lecture. She had announced her retirement at the end of the previous academic year, and the medical school had organized a small ceremony for the following week, and colleagues had written things about her in journals, and on the occasion of various anniversaries that were generous and accurate, and that she read with the slight discomfort of a person who finds it easier to discuss ideas than to be the subject of discussion. But this was the lecture, the one she always gave first. She asked who knew the oath. Every hand rose. She asked who believed they would keep it. Every hand stayed up. She said in 1941, I also thought so. She told the story for the last time from this position, from the front of this room with the chalk in her hand and the blackboard behind her, and the afternoon light coming through the high windows at the angle it always came at this time of year. She told it with the fluency of something that has been told so many times it has become the teller's own, regardless of its origins, that has been inhabited and examined from every angle, and now belongs fully to the person carrying it. When she reached the part about the examination room, she paused in the way she always paused at that part, not for effect, but because that pause was genuine, was the pause of a person who is still, after 50 years, finding the full weight of a 12-minute experience that should, by any reasonable accounting, have been unremarkable. The propaganda told us Americans were barbarians, she said, that they would torture us, experiment on us, treat us as less than human. I believed this completely. I was terrified. She looked at the room. I was completely wrong. She set the chalk down. What broke me was not cruelty. It was kindness. Professional, principled, unremarkable kindness from a doctor who kept her oath while treating an enemy. That kindness did not comfort me. It forced me to look at something I had spent 3 years not looking at, which was the state of my own oath and what I had allowed to happen to it and who had died because of what I had allowed. She was quiet for a moment. You will be tested, not in dramatic moments most of the time. You will be tested in the small decisions that no one is watching, in the cases that are inconvenient, in the patients who are difficult or frightening, or who belong to categories that your training, your culture, your government, or your own history will tell you to treat differently. And in those moments, you will have a choice. She looked around the room at 80 young faces that had no idea they were sitting in the long shadow of a cart full of soap and a piece of chocolate broken in half on a cold night in Belgium, and a woman from Dayton, Ohio, who had learned medicine from her father and kept it. The choice is always available, Lena said. I know this because I have seen it made in the worst conditions, by a person who had every reason to make a different choice and who made this one anyway, simply because she had taken an oath, and the oath did not have exceptions. She picked up the chalk one final time. She wrote the 4 words on the blackboard, primum non nocere. These words do not have asterisks, she said. They do not say, except in wartime, or except for enemies, or except when resources are limited and priorities must be set. They say, first do no harm. She set the chalk down and looked at the room. That is the oath I broke, she said. That is the oath Dr. Ellison kept. And the difference between those two things is the difference between medicine and something else that wears medicine's clothing. She paused for the last time. Go be doctors, she said. Real ones. She left the lecture hall and walked down the corridor to her office, where the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it always came, where the letter from Boston and the medical record from December 1944 were on the wall where they had been for 40 years and would remain after she left, because she had arranged with the school to keep them there, to leave them as the only decoration in a room that would be used by other people for other purposes, and would occasionally ask its new occupants the question that those 2 documents had been asking for half a century. The question that a woman from Dayton, Ohio had answered on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small white room with clean hands and a blood pressure cuff and 12 minutes of work she would never have described as heroic, because to her it was not heroic. It was simply the GWAM. It was simply the oath. It was simply what you did when you had taken a promise seriously enough to let it govern not just your aspirations, but your practice, not just the moments when keeping it was easy, but the moments when it was not. Not just the patients who were easy to see as patients, but the ones who required you to choose to see them that way. Lena Brandt died in Frankfurt in the spring of 1995. She was 77 years old. Her obituary in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung noted her decades of work rebuilding medical ethics in post-war Germany, her years of teaching at Frankfurt Medical School, her insistence that the Hippocratic Oath applied without condition or exception to every patient in every circumstance. It did not mention the examination room. It did not mention 12 minutes. It did not mention a woman from Dayton, Ohio, or a cart full of soap, or half a chocolate bar passed through the gap in the side of a truck on a cold night in Belgium, or a surgical room in France where a promise was kept for a mother who never came home. But those things did not need to be in the obituary. They were in the doctors. All of them. Every student who had sat in the third row and heard the story and carried it into the rooms where they would spend their lives, of standing over people who had placed in them the particular and complete trust that people place in the person who decides what happens next. The table is cold, the hands are warm, and in that space between what we expect from each other and what we choose to give, everything that medicine is supposed to be either lives or does not. That is the oath. That is all it has ever been. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you knew who lived by a code like this, who showed up every day and did the job without making it about themselves, leave their name in the comments. These people deserve to be remembered. And if you believe that the values in this story, the ones that showed up in a cold room in December 1944 and held, are worth preserving and passing forward, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be heard.